You ever notice how the people who preach strength the loudest are usually the ones who've never had to be strong a day in their lives? It's always the ones standing comfortably on the sidelines who feel entitled to judge the ones fighting the real battles. And that's exactly how this story begins, with a new mother lying in a hospital bed, exhausted but proud, while someone who should have supported her walks in and tries to tear her down. Imagine this: a woman who just brought life into the world, still trembling, still processing the moment she thought she might lose control, finally sees her newborn resting peacefully beside her. She's overwhelmed, relieved, grateful. But instead of receiving a warm embrace from her husband's mother, she feels the room tighten. The older woman walks in with folded arms, lips pressed tight, eyes filled with disappointment. Not concern, not love, disappointment. And all because the birth didn't go the way she wanted, because the new mother had a C-section, something she never planned, never expected, and certainly never wanted to justify. But here comes the criticism anyway, wrapped in condescension, dripping with judgment. The mother-in-law shakes her head and calls it the easy way out, as if hours of fear, pain, medical intervention, and emotional chaos could ever be labeled easy. The thing about judgment is that it always reveals more about the one speaking than the one being spoken to. And as the mother-in-law stood there, lecturing a woman who literally had stitches holding her body together, something deeper was happening. The husband watched silently. His silence wasn't neutral, it was permission, and she felt it. Every mother knows the difference between being protected and being abandoned, even if no words are spoken. The older woman leaned closer, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret of tough love, yet every word was a blade. She said, "Women in my day knew how to give birth. You didn't even try." That's the kind of sentence designed not to inform, but to break someone. It hits the deepest part of your identity, the part that whispers, "Am I enough? Did I fail?" But psychology explains something powerful here. When someone shames you during a vulnerable moment, it's usually because your vulnerability triggers their unresolved fears. A C-section represents unpredictability, danger, a moment you cannot control, and some people fear that more than anything. So instead of acknowledging their fear, they attack yours. There's a moment after childbirth when the world is supposed to get softer, gentler, but for her, everything got colder. Days passed, and the comments didn't stop. Little remarks sprinkled into conversations like poison disguised as sugar. Real mothers bond instantly. If you'd done it naturally, maybe recovery would be quicker. Some women just aren't built for motherhood. These weren't random insults. They were designed to create doubt, to make her question her instincts, her decisions, even her worth. And the worst part, her husband still wouldn't intervene. He kept saying, "She doesn't mean it," or "just ignore her." But ignoring pain doesn't make you strong. It makes you invisible. And being invisible in your own home is one of the most dangerous emotional experiences a woman can go through. Psychology calls this identity erosion. It happens when a person you love, or someone connected to your partner, slowly chips away at how you see yourself. Not in big dramatic blows, but in subtle cuts that stack over time. The brain begins to internalize criticism, not because it's true, but because repetition rewires belief. She began to dread interactions. She moved more quietly. She smiled less. She apologized more. That's what emotional pressure does. It alters behavior before you even realize the shift. One night, while feeding her baby in the dim light of the nursery, she caught her reflection in the window. She didn't look weak. She looked tired, but also awake in a new way. There was something fierce behind her eyes. A woman who had carried a life, survived surgery, and was still standing. And in that moment, something clicked. If I survived that, why am I afraid of her? The breaking point didn't arrive with shouting or some dramatic showdown. It arrived in the most ordinary moment, during a family dinner. She was sitting there, exhausted but trying to hold herself together, when her mother-in-law leaned forward, lowered her voice, and said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "Women used to be proud of giving birth the right way. I guess your generation just takes shortcuts." The table got quiet. Too quiet. Her husband looked down at his plate, pretending he didn't hear what every person in the room clearly did. And that silence, that was the cut that went deepest. Because in that moment, she finally understood. Silence can wound more than words. Silence can betray you. What happened next wasn't anger, it was clarity. For the first time, she saw the situation without the fog of fatigue or self-doubt. She saw a woman projecting her own insecurities, her fear of losing control, her need to feel superior. And she saw a husband who had never learned how to set boundaries with the person who raised him. Psychology calls this triangulation, when someone pulls a third person into the relationship dynamic to maintain power. The mother-in-law attacked not because she cared about childbirth, but because belittling the wife kept her son emotionally aligned with her. It was about dominance, not tradition. Psychology calls this identity erosion. It happens when a person you love, or someone connected to your partner, slowly chips away at how you see yourself. Not in big dramatic blows, but in subtle cuts that stack over time. The brain begins to internalize criticism, not because it's true, but because repetition rewires belief. She began to dread interactions. She moved more quietly. She smiled less. She apologized more. That's what emotional pressure does. It alters behavior before you even realize the shift. One night, while feeding her baby in the dim light of the nursery, she caught her reflection in the window. She didn't look weak. She looked tired, but also awake in a new way. There was something fierce behind her eyes. A woman who had carried a life, survived surgery, and was still standing. And in that moment, something clicked. If I survived that, why am I afraid of her? You know what the cruelest part of betrayal is? It's never the moment someone hurts you. It's the moment after, when you realize they never saw your worth to begin with. And that's exactly where the bride found herself standing. Not broken, not defeated, but awake. For the first time in months, she wasn't trying to shrink herself to fit a man's narrow idea of perfection. She wasn't chasing approval that was never meant for her. She was simply breathing, feeling, understanding. And in that clarity, she realized something life-changing. The person who was supposed to love her most had become the heaviest weight she carried. The groom sat alone after the ceremony, scrolling through comments, trying to defend himself, trying to paint her as the problem. But this time, the world wasn't buying it. People saw the truth he had always hidden. They saw a woman who stood in grace even when humiliated. They saw a man who mocked the very person he vowed to cherish. And no amount of excuses could cover that ugliness. Not now, not ever. And while he spiraled, she healed. She sat with her mother that night, sipping tea, listening to the quiet hum of the house, and for the first time since the engagement, she felt at peace. Do you know why? Because peace comes the moment you stop begging people to love you correctly. Peace comes when you stop negotiating your worth. Peace comes when you walk away from anyone who makes you feel like love is something you need to earn. Life has a way of exposing truth, especially when you try to hide it. And in the weeks that followed, the truth became impossible to ignore. The bride didn't collapse under the weight of humiliation. She didn't drown in shame. Instead, she transformed, quietly, steadily, beautifully. While the groom scrambled to repair his image, she rebuilt her life. While he tried to justify his actions, she learned to forgive herself for staying as long as she did. And that's the real triumph. Not the escape, but the awakening that comes after. People kept asking her, "How are you so strong?" But strength isn't something you're born with. It's something life teaches you through every scar, every heartbreak, every disappointment that didn't destroy you. She learned that love isn't supposed to belittle you. It isn't supposed to make you feel small. And when it does, that's not love. It's control disguised as care. She finally understood that anyone who weaponizes your insecurities was never meant to stand beside you in the first place. And slowly, she started doing things she had given up. She returned to the gym, not to lose weight for him, but to reclaim her body for herself. She started cooking meals she enjoyed without worrying about judgment. She laughed louder, slept better, breathed deeper, and each day she stepped further into the version of herself she had abandoned while trying to be perfect for someone who didn't deserve her best. The groom, meanwhile, faced the consequences of his cruelty. Opportunities slipped, friends distanced themselves. His jokes no longer landed because people finally saw them for what they were, misery disguised as humor. And it turns out when you humiliate someone kind, the world doesn't applaud you, it watches you unravel. But here's the lesson her story reveals, the one you were never supposed to forget. Healing isn't just moving on. Healing is reclaiming the parts of yourself you sacrificed for the wrong person. Healing is rewriting your story without bitterness. Healing is choosing peace, even when chaos is familiar. And maybe right now, you're standing where she once stood, confused, hurt, questioning your worth. But let me tell you something she learned the hard way. You are not defined by who failed to love you. You are defined by who you become after you free yourself from their grasp. You are defined by the courage to start again. Because in the end, she didn't just walk away. She walked toward the life she always deserved. And so can you.